Welcome to Praise Hands, home of the Praise Hands, where we are all about creative, cross-cultural Christianity. On this show, we examine the American intersection of church, race, music, and economics. And I'm your host, Robby Valderrama. Whether it was the devastating effects of COVID-19, the murders of Black Americans, including George Floyd, or yet another bitterly divisive election season, we've been through a lot this year. But here at Praise Hands, we aren't without hope. Instead, we believe that God's solution for a divided nation and world is a united church empowered by His Spirit, and that there's never been a more urgent or opportune time for creative cross-cultural Christianity. At the end of last year, you all gave so generously to support our nonprofit, and through this podcast, our Facebook group, and even countless private conversations myself and others on our team have been a part of, reconciliation is happening as a direct result of your generosity. Before we enjoy our last episode of 2020, I want to remind you about our year-end giving campaign. As I like to say, every dollar you spend or give is a vote for the kind of world you want to live in. Would you take a moment to visit praisehands.com and leave a year-end financial gift? If you have any questions about giving to our registered 501c3, or if you'd just like to connect, drop us an email at praisehandspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you in advance for your generosity. As a kingdom innovation strategist, today's guest, Doug Paul, believes that the church must shift from a mindset of being reformed to being reformers. His new book, which some have said is like a Malcolm Gladwell book for Christians, is called Ready or Not: Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World. And it's full of learnings from history, insight from the present day, and advice for the future for kingdom innovators of all kinds. And each one of you who join our year-end giving campaign by giving in the month of December will be automatically entered for a chance to win a copy of this book. Well, guys, put your thinking caps on, get comfortable, and let's enjoy this riveting conversation with Doug Paul. All right, Doug, how's it going?
It's going all right. It's been 5 straight days of rain here, and we finally have sunny skies here in Richmond, Virginia.
And you're inside doing a podcast.
I am inside doing a podcast. The windows are open right there. And so I'm looking at blue skies, and it's nice because the last couple of days I've been looking at, well, it looked like Seattle pretty much.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, my wife and I just got to take a nice long walk the other night, enjoy the beautiful fall weather in Tennessee. Fall is one of the best seasons here because you don't have the cold of the winter and you don't have the mosquitoes and the humidity of the summer. So we're soaking it up too.
Yeah, love that.
We'll just dive right in.
Let's do it. Yeah.
Your new book, Ready or Not: Kingdom Innovation for a Brave New World, is currently #1 on Amazon in Christian church growth. So first of all, congratulations.
Thank you. It's funny that it's in that category, but yeah, I'll take it.
Right. So tell our listeners the story behind maybe yourself personally, as well as this book.
The thumbnail sketch is I've been doing ministry in a couple of different contexts over the last 16 years, sometimes as a pastor, sometimes as a socialpreneur, sometimes as someone who is training pastors and or socialpreneurs, and kind of bouncing back and forth. And a couple of years ago, I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were reflecting on the last 15 years of what it is that we've been doing, trying to really pin it down. Like, what is it at its core essence that we are trying to do? And what would it look like to do more of that? And the word that really came from that was innovation. Somehow intuitively, we had stumbled onto this thing where a lot of the work that we've been doing had always had that really strong, innovative, pioneering edge in the trainings that we were doing. Kind of like a blind squirrel finding a nut. We'd figured out how to multiply it. And so that began the process where it's like, okay, if that's the word, I want to understand more of what I'm doing, because that means there's a lot I don't know. And there's a lot that I don't know how to do, and I want to get better at it. And so probably 3 years ago was when the research side of that began. It ultimately turned into a book. I don't even know that we started necessarily with that in mind, but that's where it's ended up.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's so important to dig in my own personal journey. I was in a similar spot where I'd been doing ministry for around the same amount of time in a lot of different contexts, and realized that my level of leadership had maybe been a little too far ahead of my level of understanding of where I was leading people.
Yes.
I felt a responsibility to understand where I was leading people, and not only just do that instinctively, but to do it out of a place of being able to actually lead people better.
Yes. Mistakes are inevitable and failure is inevitable, but you don't have to make the same mistakes over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking of this topic of kingdom innovation, as you talk about in your book, can you break this down for us? I think you've got 5 phases.
Yeah. Some of this isn't rocket science. It's just once you see it in front of you, you recognize, oh, a lot of people skip lots of steps.
Hmm.
The first phase is around identification. Rather than asking, how do we fix something or let's try something, it's asking, why are we doing this in the first place?
Hmm.
Again, like we have people like Simon Sinek who are writing
Hmm.
whole books on just this one central question.
Hmm.
Or there's this great book called A More Beautiful Question that really explores why it's so important to start with the right questions.
Right.
But I think so often we just start with the wrong questions. And so that identification phase is really in phase one about helping leaders identify what's the innovation that they're going after and why do they need it so that
Hmm.
they're actually solving for the problem that they have or the opportunity that's in front of them.
Absolutely.
That second phase is around ideation,
Hmm.
which is really figuring out what are the paradigms and practices and new ways of thinking and doing things that could lead us ultimately to what we call the MVP, which in the tech space or in product world, it stands for the minimum viable product. So much of the work that I do is with people and with transformation, changes of systems. And so we talk about the minimum viable process.
Hmm.
And I think so often we think around ideation, it's like, let's just grab an empty whiteboard and let's brainstorm, which is
Hmm.
fine. It just very rarely leads us to the things that we ultimately need.
Yeah.
Helping people double click on that. The third one, which I think is oftentimes in some spaces, but not in every space, the most skipped over one is experimentation, which is just because I have an idea does not mean that it is going to work. And I should actually take this pilot, I should take this MVP, and I
Hmm.
should take it for a spin. And let's actually see if it hits the mark that we want it to hit for why we're doing this innovation in the first place.
Right.
And I think about how Clayton Christensen,
Hmm.
I mean, he's written a bunch of
Innovator's
stuff.
dilemma.
Yeah. So the innovator's dilemma in that book, he talks about how 90% of successful organizations, so 80% fail out of the gate, but of the successful ones, 90% will actually succeed with a different idea than what they started with. So the experimentation is like, hey, let's weed out if this was the wrong idea. If we need to go back to the drawing board, we can.
Yeah.
Phase 4 is about mobilization. How do we codify what worked? And then
Hmm.
phase 5 is multiplication. How do we multiply it and scale it? How do we see that this innovation reaches its full potential?
That's really good. I want to maybe talk about that step number 3 of experimentation. In 2014, to go to kind of a tech story, Mark Zuckerberg announced that Facebook's internal motto was changing from move fast and break things to move fast with stable infrastructure. And I guess the story goes that some like really junior, like intern or really low on the totem pole guy, like flip some lever that actually like shut down Facebook. And they're like,
It broke some things.
maybe we need to revisit our philosophy and motto. And you've talked about this importance of failing fast, this iterative process, so you can succeed sooner. So, with the responsibility to both create solutions that are a blessing to all of society and care for individuals along the way, how can we as the church make sure that our innovation is healthy, both product and process, in both the end and the means?
Yeah. I think this is ultimately what happens when you skip the experimentation stage, because for many leaders, they are preconditioned to think that we had an
Hmm.
idea, it's the right idea, it's going to work, let's scale
Hmm.
it,
Right.
without ever knowing if it ever works. And so by starting small with a beta and a prototype, with people who know that it's a
Hmm.
beta and a
Hmm.
prototype, who know that like, hey, it may work, it may not work, that provides, I think, a real safe place of grace to experiment and try with people who know, hey, we're just trying this thing out. We don't fully
Hmm.
know what it's going to be, how it's going to work, or even if it will work. And I think if you're open with people on the front end of that, and just a small group of
Hmm.
people who seem to have a predisposition to it, you're going to be fine.
Yeah.
It's when you scale it for the whole church or the whole organization or the whole nonprofit, and then you have this like, oh crap, it doesn't work. And we just have all this collateral damage everywhere. That's the
Yeah.
problem.
What's an example of maybe someone that's done that successfully in an organization you've seen that has tried the experimentation phase and has found something better as a result?
Yeah. So I'm working with a church right now in North Carolina, and they are in the process of creating a disciple making process that is built for really deep personal transformation of the individual, and then that is also built for rapid replication. So disciples making
Hmm.
disciples, getting to like generational
Hmm.
discipleships, whereas most small groups, maybe it
Sure.
sucks, maybe it's okay, but very rarely do they actually multiply. And so they're right now in the process of, they're in that third phase with experimentation. They've launched a beta. They've got 2 of them that are going. Again, this is a decent sized church, but there are only 2 or 3 of these currently going. And they are quickly learning. Sometimes it's just very small things. What it is that they thought was going to work didn't work the way that they suspected it would. And there are just little iterations, little tweaks or adjustments that they need to make. And as they're making them live, week to week in real time, they're immediately seeing the thing shore up to get to the results that they were looking for.
Yeah, that's powerful. So if we look scripturally, what examples do we see of church innovation? And maybe to even go deeper on that, are there any biblical parameters for what church innovation should and should not look like?
Yes, there are loads. I mean, I think, if you're listening to this podcast, I mean, you probably know that we start in Genesis 1, where it's like we're made in the image of God. And what did God do? The first thing we know is that he's infinitely creative. So I think we've got quite a bit of just open space just because we're made in his image. But I think when you start to look in the book of Acts, you start to see all of these fascinating examples where the way that the church functioned in Jerusalem worked really, really well. But what happens in Acts 8 when they get scattered? And then what happens in Acts 16, where after Paul's first missionary journey, he really wants to get to Ephesus, which is like the gateway to an entire continent. And he'll eventually get there. But it says that he's blocked by the Spirit. And I think that's an important, we'll just pause there. That's a really important point, is that there is no kingdom innovation without Jesus. And so it doesn't mean you can't innovate without Jesus. You can. It's just that it's not kingdom innovation without Jesus. There's this, slightly troubling verse where Jesus says, look, apart from me, you can do nothing. And so what Paul ends up doing when he lands on the shores of Philippi, because he has that vision of the man in Macedonia, the way that he plants that church in Philippi is very different than any of the other things that we've seen before. And the reason for that is simple. There was no synagogue. So he has a playbook that worked. And all of a sudden, he's in a place where the playbook has just been shredded. And so right on the fly, as soon as he jumps off the boat, he's having to completely reimagine what his model and his strategy is going to be for planting a church. And that's like, if you start thinking about it like that, the way that you look at the book of Acts is crap. They're constantly pivoting. They're constantly tweaking, adapting, and changing. What worked in one place, what worked in Philippi doesn't work in Athens. And so the way that he plants a church in Athens, completely different. And they're completely reinventing the way that they're church planning, city to city to city, based on the context in front of them. That adaptivity, I think, for leadership is something that we greatly, greatly need to reclaim as 21st century leaders.
Yeah, that's so key. So if we look at a lot of church planting that happens right now, so much of it is done, obviously sent out at a denominational level, but even some of these mega churches that will do like essentially franchise locations. What advice do you give to a big brand of church, let's say, that wants to go to some other city? And how do they manage that tension of maintaining their brand consistency, but still maintaining that adaptability that you mentioned?
The first question, having done a fair amount of these, and I'll just be honest, with average or mediocre success, is because the real question is, how open are you to your brand being messed around with?
Right.
If the reason that you are successful is X, Y, and Z, and suddenly you're saying, hey, we are open to changing X, Y, and Z, I think the starting question is like, are you really open to it? And let's really explore that. Because the number of churches that I've worked with who are mega churches who have spent like between $1 and $5 million to try something new, only to pull everything back and be like, just kidding. We actually weren't open for it. That isn't what we wanted. There's a church that I worked with that dropped $1 million because they wanted to try a site in a kind of place they'd never gone before. And it quite frankly just didn't make sense for them to do it. And they closed up shop in 6 months. They lost $1 million. I mean, they recouped some of the cost on, I don't know, like equipment,
materials or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, they're still paying that lease.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a kind of hubris that is oftentimes associated with mega churches, some of which I think is deserved, which is like, we've been successful, we will keep being successful.
Sure.
And I think that adaptivity, that like what was successful in the past is not necessarily going to be successful in the future. And that requires, there's a moral fiber and like a spiritual fiber that requires like, We've got to deal with the question of humility. But then there's also just the leadership chops of like, can you adapt this thing that you've just always thought was going to work and now it's not?
Yeah. Tying together a few threads, you mentioned, I think it was Paul, being sensitive to the Spirit and seeing the vision of the Macedonian man and making that move. You've got an example of maybe a positive solution there. On the negative side, you have the critique of someone like a Lenin that would say that one of the flaws in capitalism is overproduction, and that necessarily leads to imperialism. How, in your view, do you see being led by the Spirit as being an option to help prevent church imperialism?
Great question, man. We're going to score one for Robby here for managing to bring in Lenin. I was a political science major. So like
There you go. Okay.
singing my
I was
song
hoping you
here.
could hang. So thanks for not disappointing me.
Yeah. What you were naming from a economic side in the wheels of production is in some ways what has happened and is increasingly happening within the falling moorings of Christendom right now, where like 10 years ago, I think it was the book On the Verge, Alan Hirsch and Dave Ferguson talked about how only 40% of our current models for doing church could possibly work. That means 60% of models that we're using have no shot of working. No one who doesn't know Jesus yet is going to possibly do that thing. We're 10 years later now, and not that much has changed. And so what I think the Spirit wants is the Spirit inevitably is going to lead us into the cracks and crevices of society where there's very little gospel presence or witness, where the gospel is not being embodied with the kind of integrity and power that is accompanied by the Holy Spirit. And so that means that we have to be open to whole new models of how we're going to do church and whole new ways of thinking about the way the church can multiply and replicate. That up to this point, when we hear about things like that, our MO tends to be, well, yeah, that happens in places like India. It's not going to happen here. Well, it's like, no, it actually has happened here. It's just that you haven't been open to it happening here.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good. Last season, we talked to Brian Sanders and
great.
Catherine Ng, microchurches in Tampa. And I find their model really fascinating for, like you said, filling in the cracks of what's happening in society. Moving forward, if you had to kind of take a guess over the next 10 years in terms of the traditional megachurch model versus the microchurch model, what do you think that balance is going to look like within the church?
I think there's something happening within the church. I'm going to skate the question a little, but maybe I'll get back to it. We'll see.
Sure.
I think there's something happening larger within culture, and listeners of this podcast will definitely see this, that is being mirrored in the church. And I think COVID has served as an accelerator. So I think we're seeing these two polarities of things bundling and unbundling. And so you've got Disney buying the MCU, and then you've got them buying National Geographic, and like all these things rolling up into these giant monoliths, right? But at the same time, you've got on the other continuum, this much deeper localized, like, I don't want the chain restaurant. I don't want the movie expression like you. I want that very independent, very local, very of the ground, of the soil, terroir kind of thing, right? And I think you're going to see a winnowing of the middle where that's just not going to be sustainable as we think about church. I think you're going to see mega churches get bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, like I was working with a mega church who recently, like they are already probably in the top 6 or 7 largest churches in the United States. And they acquired is the wrong word, but like acquired, because I can't think of a better word. Another mega church, which again, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying like, it's crazy to think that a church of 38,000 just subsumed a church of 8,000. They're just one big monolith now. At the same time, you see, even on the megachurch level, them starting to unbundle. So you see this happening with, Tim Keller's church with Redeemer. You see this happening. There's a church I'm working with in Detroit that's doing this right now, where they're unbundling. But I think more localized expression, let's get away from mega, thinking about micro churches, like networks of micro churches, or even just like neighborhood churches, like the one that I'm in. Our church is focused on one neighborhood, 2 square miles, nothing outside of that. And most of the people who are part of our church would never consider being part of a mega church. And again, not because mega churches are bad, but because the expression of church that they feel called to, the mega church can't deliver on that. So I think it's the winnowing of the middle. Increasingly, you're going to see the medium-sized church, I think, is going to disappear in the next 10 years. I told you I'd eventually get back.
You did. Well done. Well done.
Circled around the cul-de-sac and eventually high-fived at my mailbox.
Yes. No, very good. Speaking of your church, East End Fellowship, Richmond, Virginia, we had David Bailey on the show a couple seasons back. One of the things that we believe here at Praise Hands is that when diverse community comes together, creativity is bound to happen. So in your local congregation, as well as in the broader church, what relationship have you noticed between diversity and creativity?
So David lives 3 blocks from where I'm sitting right now. I'm sitting in my house. So David is a close friend. He actually just finished a 3-year term as an elder at our church. I'm an elder right now. It is definitely, and all of the research backs this up. You see this from a corporate perspective. My wife is in the C-suite of an ad agency. This is like a drum that she's constantly banging. The more diversity, the better the creative work. And so if you don't want to make a moral argument around diversity in the workplace, then let's just make an economic one, because the economics are better when we have more diversity. The same is true in the church, I think, where the only way that you can hold what seem like very disparate cultures together is to be about culture making together. Our worship and teaching pastor right now, Aaron, very different background from me, different race than me, sees the world very differently than me. And she can sing. I cannot sing. And so the way that
Aaron Rose.
Yeah, I'm a terrible singer. Aaron Rose, yeah. When we are talking about worship services and what that looks like, the collision of those things together, because we're both open to creating something new together.
Yeah.
It fosters this electric environment. There is nothing like one of our worship services. And I'm not even saying that's necessarily good. I'm just saying it is a culture unlike anything that I've stepped into in a church, because it's so representative of both the diversity that is present, but also the willingness to, like, it's not diversity for diversity's sake. We are creating this kingdom culture with the spiritual family that we've got together.
Yeah, that's excellent. So I'm sure in that process, in order to get something that no one else has, that sound and that unique DNA, you've also had to sacrifice things that a lot of other people have. As you've navigated through that, what metrics would you say you as a church have used to evaluate whether what you're doing is successful or not?
Just from a diversity standpoint, it's a lot of the key metrics that anyone would be talking about. Like, what does our pastoral staff look like? How diverse is it? What does our elder team look like? What are our house churches, which are sort of the backbone? We would describe ourselves as a network of house churches who regularly gather for public worship. What does that look like? What is the makeup of the participants and the people who are in all of those house churches? So some of those are just classic metrics, right? But some of them are a little bit more, I would say, discussion oriented and qualitative. So one of the things that David came up with that was, I think, very helpful was talking about, hey, no one should ever feel, when they come to one of our worship services, they should never feel comfortable more than 70% of the time.
Yeah.
He calls it the 70% rule. We literally had an elder meeting on Monday night when we were saying, I mean, like, everything's different in COVID. No one's comfortable just sitting in front of the screen. But just kind of reflecting back to where we were pre-COVID and thinking towards the future, saying, like, we've gotten too comfortable. We are not pressing, it's not pressing the envelope enough, but it works for David Bailey and it works for me, for Doug Paul. Like, I am no longer uncomfortable. What's the level changes that we need to make to get to that 70% rule or more again? And I think for us, that's been a qualitative discussion point where we're thinking about, if it is about culture making, artifacts of culture are a way that we can evaluate the kind of culture we're making. Our worship service is one of those artifacts. So that's a qualitative discussion we're regularly having.
Yeah. No, that's helpful to know. And I think a lot of churches that are navigating through that same conversation can really benefit from that. I think the stat that's close to that I've heard, I think it was one of the first multiracial church leaders in America was, I believe, Robert Weber or George Weber from New York City. And he used to say, I don't want people to be comfortable more than 75% of the time. So that same sort of range.
We've upped it. We're now to 70.
Yeah, you guys are even going to the next level.
But I will say, I mean, just to hop on that, I don't necessarily like it all the time. But I think that's important to say is there are trade-offs. When you say yes to one thing, you're saying no to something else. And part of it is, just based on, I don't know, my own personal taste or whatever. Sometimes like I just want to sing Hillsong. And I mean like, or I just want to sing a John Mark McMillan song, or I don't want to sing a song that our urban songwriting interns have written that is kind of odd.
Sure.
Like I want to do something that is of, my background and my experience. That's the thing that you trade up. I think it's just worth saying that there are trade-offs when you do these things.
Yeah, no, thank you for your vulnerability there. I think sometimes when we look at different movements around the country, different things, we can tend to see the grass as being greener and we say, oh man, look at that cool thing that they're posting on social media. Like, we only see the highlights, right?
You do.
And when you dig in and see, no, there are real trade-offs, but we've made those trade-offs for a very specific reason because we believe in something here. I think that's very powerful to let people kind of behind the curtain. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah.
One of the questions we got from one of our Praise Hands Facebook group members, we've got a private curated space where people can ask these questions and really get feedback and talk in a safe space. And I had somebody that got a question in like literally right before I hopped on this interview. So
Wow.
he said, what are the unmet needs you see affecting American society the most in the near future? And how might followers of Christ be especially positioned to address these needs?
All right, I have something that comes to mind, and I think it answers the question. 79% of Americans would self-identify as having a technology addiction. There's a Netflix show that just came out, The Social Dilemma, but it takes about 10 years for research to really come back when you're introducing a new kind of technology. The research has come back from the first 10 years of having these little mobile devices that we call smartphones. And it's not good. Like the level of addiction and how we are addicted to the dopamine hit that's released in our brains is really destructive, and it will only get worse. I feel like in the same way that Alcoholics Anonymous was able to serve this incredibly practical material need, like I need to stop drinking. There are 130 million people in AA right now. And all of these people, I'm not saying they all became Christians, but a lot of them became Christians. I think we're going to have that kind of opportunity. And it's got to start with the church first. Like it should start. Like if I have a technology addiction as a leader, my first priority is to use the laboratory of my own life and to actually get some freedom there. But my life would be better if I wasn't addicted to that. And then I've got a good news story to tell and invite people into. And I feel like there's a real opportunity that is, I know some churches are starting to tinker around with some of these ideas, but I think I'm really hoping and praying that in 5 to 10 years, there are going to be some significant works and programs that are going to help people, because I think the idea of Gen Z growing up and being digital natives with mobile devices, we were digital natives without mobile devices. They have that epoch defining event of everything in their collective memory is going to be post iPhone. That's going to shape them in some profound ways that I don't think we're ready for, but hopefully we'll put some work into.
Yeah, I think that ties right into one of the big questions that I see affecting the church is when we see unjust systems or systems that are tilted a certain way, what level of detachment from those systems should we have and innovation to actually replace and disrupt those systems versus doing the best we can inside those current systems. I see that happening inside of our economic systems. I actually saw the Facebook Live or something you did with Dave Ferguson, and you guys were chatting about Black-owned banks.
That was fascinating.
Perfect example inside the current system, saying how can we really be able to restore justice kind of $1 at a time. And I think those are important. At the same time, one of the questions facing us is if the way that currency is handled in our current economy is fundamentally consolidating power, what responsibility as a church do we have to actually out innovate the world when it comes to money and economics? And I would say the same thing is true for technology. And Andy Crouch, who you referenced earlier, mentioned his work with culture making. He's got the book TechWise Family, some great writing on this. I think he's actually working on another project now, going even deeper on the technology side of things. But one of the questions is, to what degree can we engage with the systems as we are becoming increasingly dependent on them for our daily life and even basic things of commerce in these different topics? What snippet of advice, or longer than a snippet, would you give to church leaders as they find themselves in these systems that might be overwhelming, but they still want to pastor their people through it?
This is a great question. And I think it really falls in line with some of the large theological clashes that we're seeing happen right now, whether we're talking about someone who's Kuyperian, like being in the halls of power being a good thing.
7 cultural mountains, all that.
Yeah. And then on the other side, having this sort of like neo-Anabaptist movement that's happening and is really gaining steam right now. And then some things in between. I mean, you've got Dreher with the Benedictine option, and I think it's Rod Dreher. He wrote a book.
Yeah, I actually just heard about him. Somebody told me I need to check him out like 2 days ago.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
He's got some good stuff in there. I would give more than a soft critique to a couple of things, but it's belonging in the conversation of what you're asking here. I think I'm of the opinion personally that there isn't a single way to do this. There really is an ability for us to navigate faithfully in different ways and with different callings. Using technology as an example, I think there are some churches, what they feel called to and for faithfulness and obedience is going to be in many ways to like the way that we disciple people is to tell them to reject technology by doing X, Y, and Z. So get a light phone, don't get a smartphone. I mean, and it's going to be very instructive, almost in the way that the Methodists were instructive around do this, do this, do this. Not in a, we're trying to give ourselves back over to law, but in like, because these cultural forces are against us, here are the practical ways through the power of God we come against those cultural forces.
Yeah.
And then we tell people, look at our life. Is it better?
Yeah.
I think other folks are going to feel like they've got a missional mandate to be in the system and to upend the system. So that example you were talking about with Dave Ferguson, the simple idea of what if 100 of the biggest churches in the United States simply shifted their money from Wells Fargo or Bank of America, or whatever it was, into a Black-owned bank? The ripple effects of that are massive.
Right.
He sent me a paper afterwards, the University of Chicago professor that he was referencing had written, and it is brilliant. And I'm like, I was just dumbfounded on the call. I was like, I can't believe I've not heard of this or thought of this before, but I'm so glad someone else is. And I think that's an example of, it's not necessarily one way or the other, but it's being able to have very critical conversations. We have to be able to call a spade a spade. So if you can't say that pointing at whatever that thing is racism, or if you can't point at this thing and being like, well, that is like economic inequality. If we can't even have those conversations, we can't possibly have conversations around calling when it comes to how we respond in a faithful way with obedience and with the missional mandate that God has given us.
Right. It's that first step in your 5 steps of kingdom innovation. You've got to, as I think it's what Max Dupree says, leader's job is to define reality.
Define reality. Yeah, absolutely. And we are so poor at being able to do that and so ungenerous, I think, in being able to hear opposing viewpoints. I don't love everything that Tim Keller shares all of the time. The thing that I maybe appreciate about him more than anything else is his ability to like talk with someone generously who he disagrees with. And I mean, like, he's got a simple, practical thing that's like, look, if you're going to talk about someone else's argument that you disagree with, give the best version of their argument, not the worst. And I think we've got to learn to have those kinds of conversations. And let me tell you, Twitter, Facebook, it's a dumpster fire for having those right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe to dig into that a little bit more, when it comes to the church, what do you see as being the biggest obstacles for us accurately assessing reality and calling a spade a spade? Like, why has that not happened to the degree that it has needed to up to this point?
I think some of it depends on the tribe that you're in. I don't think the historically Black church is struggling to call a spade a spade. I don't know that by and large the Catholic Church is struggling to call a spade a spade. And I think there are some mainline churches that aren't struggling either, as much as I think evangelicals like to throw water balloons at them that are filled with paint. But I think Mark Knoll wrote this, I can't remember if it was an article or just a little short book in the early 90s called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. When you trace it back historically, there was a break that happened in roughly the 1920s, where we stopped using like our minds to wrestle with things. And we just started giving silly Sunday school answers that start with like, because the Bible says so. I guess on one level, that's fine, even though we can disagree or talk about interpretation. But on the other side, it's like, well, what if they don't believe in the Bible? Like, are you telling me that you can't ever have a conversation unless someone believes that this is the inerrant word of God? Like, that's ridiculous. And we're suffering from almost 100 years of a tribe of Christians who are the dominant tribe and expression of Christianity in North America, who have struggled to deal critically with some of the biggest questions of our age and have just shut conversations down. I think that's the starting point in my mind. I might be hypercritical. Who knows?
Yeah. So taking that even one step further, if churches have identified that as an issue, and or even Christian leaders that may not be on staff at a church or whatnot, and saying, we realize this is a deficiency in our space. What's maybe one piece of advice you would give to them for how to facilitate those needed conversations and have that shift happen?
I feel like the answer is in your question. It's facilitating conversations. Actually creating some space where people can come in and thoughtful people with expertise in facilitation can foster some conversations. I do think this is one of the things that Q Ideas has done well historically. And I think why they were, particularly when they launched in 2006, was so needed at the time, is like evangelicals were not talking about things like climate change. That was a dirty word or two words, but they created like, hey, there's a way that we can actually talk about some of the biggest questions that are in culture today. And we can bring thoughtfulness and generosity and grace to these kinds of conversations and still be Christian and still think well and be curious. I think we can do that on the local level. We need to be doing that on the local level. Being able to think critically is a skill set like anything else, right? You can learn to read. You can learn to ride a bike. You can learn to cook. You too can learn to think critically. We just need to create spaces where I think that can happen and be committed to it. It's not going to go well the first couple times.
Yeah.
Like it could be a train wreck. That doesn't mean we should stop doing it.
Yeah. That's great. So on a personal level, how are you enjoying having crossed this milestone? You've released your book. What does that feel like?
It's a mixture of things. I think the first week is just all adrenaline and you're just going. Monday morning, the second week, man, the adrenaline was gone. I'm a huge West Wing fan. The president in the West Wing, played by Martin Sheen, his catchphrase is always, "What's next?" And that's kind of my MO, is always like, all right, what's next? And we made the decision to fast track the book when COVID hit. It was normally an 18-month process. We did it in 6, which I will never do again. But I feel like the Lord did give me a word at the beginning, which was like to be faithful to all aspects of this. And so, part of it is like writing it and editing. And I mean, that's just enough. But then you've got like the marketing of it, and you have all the different things that go along with it. And I think that has been actually a source of strength in this, coming out of that first week, which is remember what the call was. And so there's this sort of line of demarcation personally that I feel like I have. My wife and I's anniversary is coming up in mid-November. And so we're taking a 2 or 3 day trip. And I feel like that's sort of like the line of demarcation.
Yeah.
Leave nothing off the field, give everything you got, go for it, and then really enjoy those 3 days.
Yeah. Well, congratulations again. And we're going to be doing a giveaway, which we'll announce the details of on Instagram. If you don't win that, which is going to be everybody except for one person, you need to go out and hit up Amazon.
Buy it anyway. That's right.
Buy Ready or Not by Doug Paul. You will not be disappointed. Doug, thank you so much for your time. How can people learn more about the great work that you're doing?
You can go to dougpaul.org. Like everyone else under the sun, I've got a newsletter that you can be part of. There are a bunch of, I think, pretty good resources that you can download for free without getting on the newsletter as well. So dougpaul.org.
Awesome. Hey, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate the work that you're doing. Thanks for tuning in to this last episode of 2020. Before we go, I want to first acknowledge the hard work of the faithful and talented team that puts this show on behind the scenes. Simone, Mackenzie, Jay, and Nicole, I truly couldn't do this without your help. And a huge shout out to our monthly donor team. You know who you are, and I couldn't be more grateful for you. In closing, I want to encourage every listener to stop by praisehands.com and join our year-end giving campaign. Like I mentioned earlier, each person who donates in December will be automatically entered for a chance to win Doug Paul's book, Ready or Not. Between now and season 5 next year, I'm praying God's blessings over you and your family. In the meantime, feel free to join our Praise Hands Facebook group or follow us on Instagram at Praise Hands Podcast. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year from all of us here at Praise Hands.